Alright, so today's lecture is going to be sort of a combination of two different chapters in our textbook. We're going to look at artificial selection, which is found in the genetic engineering chapter, which is chapter 13. And then we're going to look at natural selection, which is found in our evolution unit for chapter 15. These are the three main objectives of this lecture. Make sure you read them, keep them in mind when you get to the end of the lecture. Go back to them, read through them, and see if you can answer them. If not, review the lecture again. Again, if you have any questions, always feel free to contact me. Okay, so artificial selection is the same thing as selective breeding. It's the idea that humans control breeding between organisms based on desired characteristics they want in offspring. Okay, one such field where we do this quite often is in our dog breeds. For example, we're going to control two dogs mating together so that they produce a desired characteristic like a shiny coat or a specific height or symmetrical body measurements. We see this a lot in show dogs. Okay, if you look at the cost of a dog that has been purebred versus the cost of, a mutt, okay, there's a lot more money going into the purebred because they are, mated so selectively together. So, selective breeding and artificial selection, humans control what two organisms mate together, and that control is based around desired characteristics that they want in the offspring. So there are two different types of artificial selection or selective breeding. Okay, the first type is inbreeding. This is where we will purposefully breed individuals that are extremely similar to each other. And the purpose behind that is that we want to maintain their characteristics. So for example, here we have a picture of a dog breed. And this was, a drawing that was made, a couple hundred years ago. When we look at that same dog today, you see there are not a lot of differences, okay? That means that these dogs have been bred over and over again with mates that look just like them and that have very similar characteristics so that we can keep those characteristics very similar. You mate a poodle with a poodle, so all the offspring are very poodle-like. Okay. Taking a look at this picture, how could you tell that these puppies are inbred? Okay, if we compare them to each other and then also to their parent, they look extremely similar. They all share many of the, Labrador traditional characteristics. They're not hybrids, okay, and we'll talk about hybrids in a second. So an advantage of inbreeding is that we are able to control the traits and we can maintain them. So mating after mating, generation after generation, we ensure the puppies are all going to come out looking the same way. A disadvantage, unfortunately, when you mate two organisms that are so genetically similar to each other, it increases the chance of bringing together recessive alleles, and that can cause more genetic disorders. So for example, as a child, I had a miniature poodle, and when we bought the miniature poodle for like $1,500, by the way, when we bought that miniature poodle, we were handed a series of pamphlets about all of the disorders that are very common in the poodle subspecies. So, for example, poodles tend to have hip problems. They also have increased lung issues and breathing problems as they get older. The reason why this is seen so frequently is because as the poodles are bred together over and over again, we're bringing together those two recessive alleles, and that's leading to an increased chance of genetic disorders. All right, the second type of selective breeding or artificial selection is going to go the other way. Okay, instead of mating two very similar individuals together, we're going to mate two dissimilar individuals together. And we can even attempt to do this with two different species. Okay, the reason why we want to do this is because we're looking to take traits that are found in each of those individuals and bring them together in one. Okay, a great example here, we have a buffalo, which is rather large. We have a cow, which has rather tasty meat. And when we mate them together, we get what's called a beefalo, a cow-like organism that has the size of a buffalo. So that's very beneficial. We desire the taste and the mannerism of a cow, I guess you could say, as far as food product, but the buffalo, we desire their size. So now what that means is we've created a hybrid of, producing more beef per organism in a way. So that's going to help with our economy and our food supply. Okay, hybridization has helped in many ways. This man here, his name is Luther Burbank. I don't know if you've studied this in history or not, but in Ireland there was something called a potato famine. And the reason why there was a potato famine is because unfortunately a disease got into their potato crop, and since all of the potatoes were the same, because they had all been grown from the seeds from the previous generation, okay, a lot of inbreeding, they were all affected by this disease. And so what Luther Burbank did is he traveled around to other parts of Ireland that were not affected by the potato famine, and he picked up potatoes that were very hardy and were very unlikely to be affected by any sort of disease. He brought those back and he mated the two different types of potatoes together, and the result was he created a hybrid that was disease resistant and therefore had a high crop yield. In other words, meaning if you planted, 100 plants, you could use many more of them that would actually, turn into food rather than those that would rot or be affected by pests or other things like that. So this actually ended up saving the farmers during the potato famine and helping to bring it to an end. So with hybridization, the advantage is we're taking a characteristic we desire here in one organism and a characteristic we desire here in another organism, and we're bringing them together in one organism. The disadvantage, though, is that often because we're talking about two organisms from different species, that offspring is what we call sterile, meaning that it is not able to reproduce. So on the next slide, I'm going to show you some examples of different hybrids. But one example of that disadvantage, a mule. A mule is created by crossing a horse and a donkey. Okay, a horse has, a very nice temperament and is rather tall, whereas a donkey is known for being able to carry a lot of things at the same time. So you combine a nice temperament and a taller physique with the ability to carry a lot of weight, and you get a mule, which is a very good pack horse in essence, for farmers or for other people to use to carry things for them. Unfortunately, that mule cannot mate together and produce more mules. It is sterile. It cannot have any offspring. So here's a page of a whole bunch of different hybrids that we've created. Okay, up here, this is called a tangelo. This is a combination of a tangerine and a pomelo, or you could call it a tangerine and a grapefruit. This is a plum-cot, so it's a combination of a plum and an apricot. This one you may have seen actually in stores. I know Wegmans carries it. It's called broccoflower, and that is a combination of broccoli and cauliflower. Okay, this one is a zonkey. You can take a guess. That would be a zebra and a donkey. Okay, this one is a kama. That is a combination of a camel and a llama. This one up here, this is a combination of a leopard and a lion, so we call that a leopard. Okay, over here we have a tiger and a lion, and I'm saying tiger first because if the the male is first, then that you use that part of their name first. So, I'm sorry, not male, female. So a female tiger and a male lion, this is going to be a tigron. And down here, this one is my favorite, okay? You see over here this white bear, this is a polar bear. In the background, we have a grizzly bear. When you cross those two as a hybrid, you will get a Pizzly bear, or it is also known as a Growler bear. Now, hybrids bring up lots of questions for students because they want to know, oh, can we cross this with this? The answer is we don't know until we try, okay? If you notice, a lot of these organisms that are hybrids are extremely similar to each other, okay? For example, a camel and a llama, they are rather similar organisms. Could we create a hybrid between, a camel and a cat? More than likely not. Part of it has to do with the fact that the chromosome numbers tend to be very similar, and also they possess very similar genes. There are a number of attempts to make hybrid organisms that just don't work because the gametes will physically not meet up. We're going to talk about the reverse of this, which would be where we take one species and split them up into two as we get through evolution a little further. Okay, so we've been doing this, through two types of selective breeding. We've talked about inbreeding and hybridization just through mating events, but sometimes that's not enough. So what are other ways that we can increase variation artificially? Instead of worrying about the mating, let's start messing around with some genes. So we can use chemicals and we can use radiation to induce mutations that cause variations. For example, plant breeders will use drugs that cause polyploidy, okay? Poly meaning many, ploidy would be sets of chromosomes. So what it does is it purposely causes non-disjunction to happen so that you have multiple sets of chromosomes in your cells. In animals, that's fatal, okay? A polyploidy does not result in a live human. They cannot survive. But in plants, it actually doesn't affect them. What happens is the plants are able to survive. Just for example, the watermelon that is produced by polyploidy is seedless. So for the watermelon, that means that it's sterile or unable to reproduce. But how many of you prefer seedless watermelon over regular watermelon? Another thing we can use for mutation, we can use radiation. And if we radiate bacteria in a certain way, what we can do is we can cause genes to change that allow them to actually consume and break down oil in the environment. So oil-eating bacteria, that's something that we talked about in our genetic engineering section, but we can also, through radiation, engineer bacteria so that they naturally will break down oil. This is very handy, in the case of oil spills. For example, the spill that happened down in the Gulf, they considered using a test site. There are fears about releasing bacteria into the wild in these cases of oil spills, but nonetheless, they are definitely helping to clean up oil spills in a contained environment. So if all this can happen artificially, if we force it, is there any way that we can is there any way that this selection, these desired traits, happen naturally? And the answer is yes, absolutely. Okay, so now we're switching over into the evolution part. So artificial selection are ways that humans physically control who survives, physically control who mates with whom to produce offspring that have certain traits. Well, nature does this as well, and it's based on how well you fit to your environment, okay? The environmental fit is a key thing here. So instead of traits being artificially selected for based on what humans want, the traits we find in organisms are based on how well they're going to fit their environment. This is also known as differential reproduction. So before we go any further, I want you to play around with a simulation here. A landmark example of natural selection is shown in the English peppered moth. So it's a moth and it's peppery color. It can be black or it can be white. Okay? And there are different phases throughout history where we had more black moths and more white moths. And the story is actually very interesting. So here's the simulation. I just want to take you to it so that you can see the link here. Okay, the link is not the same as what's on top of the worksheet that you got in class. So please make sure that you access either this link by copying it down now or go to the Docs and Links page, and I've already posted it for you. It's posted under Pepper Moth Simulation. So this is the main site you should see. You can read about the background of the life cycle of the moth. You can read about some of the pollution that occurred in England and how that's related to the peppered moth. You can read about Dr. Kettlewell and how he was the one who looked at the effects of this on how the organisms were selected for or against in nature. And then down here, here's where you're actually going to click into the simulation. So when you click down here, they're going to describe the simulation to you. Okay, you'll click next. All right. And then they're going to ask you to choose a forest. So you're going to do the simulation once with a light forest and once with a dark forest. Okay. The idea here is that your mouse is going to become a bird and you are supposed to eat as many moths as you can in as short amount of time as you can. So just be natural, okay? Don't hunt for specific colors or anything like that. And then look at your data, compare how your data differs between a light and a dark forest, and then answer the summary questions. Okay, when you finish with that, you can come back to the rest of the lecture then. Alright, so hopefully you've gone through the simulation at this point, and what you should have seen was when the forest was light in color, the moths that were light were able to survive more. They were less likely to be eaten because they blended into their environment, so their predators had a harder time finding them. However, after the Industrial Revolution, when the forest was covered with the dark, heavy soot all over the bark, there was a change in the popularity of the alleles that were able to survive. And so then what happened was dark moths were more likely to survive because they better blended in with their environment. So again, it always comes back to a fit to your environment. And Dr. Kettlewell used this as a landmark example to explain natural selection. Okay. Dr. Kettlewell was not the first person to come up with this idea of natural selection. It was actually Darwin, and he came up with 5 main points, and this is a huge slide, so make sure you put big stars on this one. Okay? He said, first of all, populations have variation. Some of those variations can be favorable, meaning suited for an environment. More offspring are produced than can survive. The ones that survive have those favorable traits that allow them to fit their environment. And populations can change over time in response to their environment. So big star on this slide. These are the 5 main points. If, let's say, for example, you had to write an essay on natural selection, I would make sure I address each of these 5 points. Specifically, if you had to line it up with an example, let's say. All right, so let's look at them each one at a time. So population has variation. Natural variation exists within species. Okay, the humans are a great example. When you look around, do we all look identical? No, absolutely not. Are we all from the same species? Yes. So for example, some cows, they just naturally produce more milk than others, and some plants, they naturally grow larger fruit than others. Okay? Artificial selection, when it's controlled by humans, we would choose to mate the cows that produce more milk because that is the trait we desire. Natural selection is going to act on whatever trait is going to be best for the environment. So when we look at some examples of natural variation, all of these cobs of corn, they are all from the same species, but we can see there is color differences. Same things with these mice here and also these snails. All the same species, but there are small variations. And again, linking back to chapter 12, that's due to mutations within the DNA. Okay? Sometimes these variations can be favorable, okay? For example, what color shell of the snail helps it to survive better, okay? It's all about being fit to the environment where you live. So here's another example. Rabbits that naturally have longer leg muscles are able to run faster. Why do you think that might be a favorable trait? Let's say a rabbit that's being chased by a fox, for example. If you can run faster, you're more likely to survive. And so that trait, then, that variation that you possess is considered favorable in your environment. If you possess a trait like that, that is inheritable, meaning it is part of your DNA, we consider that an adaptation. Okay? Some students ask questions like, if you are a bodybuilder and you mate with another bodybuilder, will you have a bodybuilder baby? Think about it. No. The answer is no. Okay? The size of your muscles and the working out that you've done throughout your lifetime is not built into your genetic code. So when you join your sperm and your egg together to make that baby, there are no genes associated with, how big your muscles are. So you will not give birth to a bodybuilding baby. Key thing with an adaptation is it must be inheritable. So it has to be encoded in your DNA. I'd put a big circle around this one if I were you. Okay, so when we look at adaptations, let's look at the American beaver per se, for example. Okay, when we look at the way that this beaver has changed over time, okay, they have long, sharp teeth that never stop growing. That is an adaptation that helps them to survive. Think about the fact that beavers are constantly using their teeth and they're being ground down, like, just like if you would wear down the teeth of a knife by using it over and over again. The fact that they never stop growing allows them to deal with that wear and tear. Okay, they have webbing on the back feet, so in between their toes, they're webbed. And what does that imply? That implies that they're near water. So somewhere along the way, beavers that have webbed back feet are able to survive better than beavers that don't. And so this is considered a favorable trait in their environment. The flap of skin that's behind the teeth so that they can carry sticks in the water without drowning, and the fact that their nostrils and ears can close while underwater. So these are all traits that are inherited in genes of their DNA that they can pass on to their offspring. These are things that make a beaver, but also make a beaver successful in its environment. Okay. 3, more offspring are produced than survive. Okay, so of all the variations we have and all of the organisms that are produced within a species, not everybody's going to survive. So there's what we call a struggle for existence. And that involves a competition. So what do individuals compete for? You compete for space or shelter. You compete for mating. And also you compete for food and water. So these are resources that are going to affect how well you survive. All right? So think about mating rituals. I'm sure you've seen lots of nature movies and things like that. You can look down here. These two animals here, I'm assuming they are male. It looks as though they are fighting in a mating ritual because they are trying to compete to win the ability to reproduce with a certain female. What are they using for competition? They're using headbutting and their horns. So here it seems as though a strong head and longer or thicker horns would be an adaptation, because that would help them survive and that would make them more likely to reproduce. Okay? If you think back to the rabbit example, there's a struggle to survive because that fox is needing to eat a rabbit, and when he starts chasing two rabbits, he's going to go for whichever one he can catch first. Who's that going to be? That's going to be the one that does not possess the adaptation. So the one with the shorter leg muscles will run slower. So being able to run fast is an adaptation. So now there's a struggle to survive, and there are differences between individuals. This ties it all together. Okay, this is a really good slide. Survival of the fittest. It's the idea that if you possess these desirable traits, you're more likely to survive, and therefore you're more likely to reproduce and pass those genes on to the offspring. So we call this your fitness level. Okay, we don't mean fitness like you went and worked out at a gym, but we mean the ability to survive and reproduce long enough, or survive long enough and reproduce to pass those genes on to future offspring. I've talked about this many times in class before, that that's the goal of just about every living thing on the planet. In fact, some of them have a lifespan of mere hours just so that they can survive and reproduce. Humans are a terrible example of fit organisms because we have other desires other than just survival and reproduction. For example, if you look at a squirrel sitting in a tree, he's not contemplating whether he wants to have kids now or later, because he's considering going for his law degree. Okay, that just doesn't happen in nature. So humans definitely are not a good example of organisms that adhere to this standard. But every other living thing, main goal in life, purpose of life, is to survive long enough to reproduce and pass those traits on to your offspring. Okay, so just putting together some pictures here. Remember when I talked about the bodybuilder, this diagram, or this little image here, I guess you could say, is poking fun at the idea of survival of the fittest. Okay, here you see a gaggle of geese or ducks, I guess you would assume, and they're all at the gym working out, and you see the sign fly or die. The idea here, the thing that's supposed to be funny, is that they're all trying to work out to make themselves the most fit for their environment, so they are more likely to survive and reproduce. Again, we know that working out at a gym, something that's not inheritable, will not be passed on to the offspring, and so therefore we don't consider that an adaptation. Down here in this picture, competition is tough, okay, and sometimes that competition is eat or be eaten. In a pack of running wild caribou, there's always going to be some that can't run as fast as the others, or some that decide to go right instead of left when the whole group goes left. The making of that decision is going to be the difference between life or death. So here we see two individuals that have separated from the pack, okay, and the cheetah has clearly made the choice to go after the weaker one. So this individual was able to get away faster. This one was not quite so lucky. So if this is a trait, okay, the ability, for how fast they can run, if that's something that's in their genes, they can pass that on. Who's passing it on, though? Is it this guy? No, because unfortunately, he is going to be eaten. So he will not be passing those genes on. Instead, this is the individual who will survive and reproduce, therefore passing those faster genes on. Okay. Where does this lead to? Well, over time, that causes these changes in population. And, we can drill it all the way back down to, how frequently we see certain alleles for genes in populations, which we'll discuss that more in class after this lecture. But the idea is known as descent with modification. Okay, so over time, there are some populations of individuals that have a very high fitness level. Okay, they're extremely successful. They're able to survive and reproduce because they possess those adaptations. Now, if you're in that in crowd, let's say, and you need to choose a mate, are you going to choose a mate that is like you, or are you going to choose a mate that doesn't have the adaptation? Okay, you're going to choose a mate that is like you because you want to ensure that your offspring has the best chance of survival. So what happens is over time, you see a population start dividing itself, the haves and the have-nots. So this group of organisms, they reproduce with themselves, and because they possess the adaptation, they continue passing it on. This group of organisms, they will reproduce among themselves. They possess no adaptation, and their survival will be affected by that. As they separate from one another, and we go through generations of, change, generations of offspring, more and more differences will develop between the two populations, and ultimately, that's how we separate and form two species. Okay, so if we take that and we follow it back up, we could say these two species originally descended from a common ancestor, or they shared a common ancestor at one time. If you follow that all the way back, almost looking like the roots of a plant, okay, you can follow each branch back to, a meeting point. Ultimately, you could use this to describe the fact that all living things, or once living things, we can include in extinct organisms, at one time shared a common ancestor. Okay, so let me explain this with a diagram here. All right, so if we're looking at this, we have our first generation at the top, and then you'll see sequential generations changing, fourth, fifth, sixth generation. Okay, starting at the top, it looked as though we have, a plain exoskeleton here, and it's kind of dark in color. All right, as generations were created, some differences occurred. Okay, spontaneous mutation would be the explanation of where that happened, but these organisms were rather successful. Okay, and so they were able to pass this mutation on. These organisms, it seems as though, were not as successful. So there was some sort of advantage in the environment to having this color for your exoskeleton, for this insect. And then we branch down to another generation, and here we see a mutation where spots have developed. Okay, and when we look at the chance of offspring being produced, we notice that these organisms are not producing offspring, but the ones with the dots are. Okay, until we get down into these generations and we see it appears as though the ones that survived and reproduced the best had a red exoskeleton with dots. So that could be related to the fact that, maybe they were able to camouflage with their environment better. Maybe it was easier to see each other from far away, so they were more likely to find a mate. Whatever the reason is, this was an extremely successful population, and they possessed these traits. Now, do traits always have to die out if they're not successful? Not really. What could happen is this organism could branch off and start forming its own, its own species in a way. Okay? The difference is they would not be mating with each other, and they would form their own species separate from these. But you can see, evolution is a sort of a common sense idea. Okay, so going back to those 5 points, we see natural variation. Okay, there's a struggle to survive. Not all organisms are going to survive. Some of those variations are considered favorable. The ones that are increase your chance of surviving and reproducing. So that whole survival of the fittest idea. The ones that are not favorable, for example, no spots, okay, they are not going to survive long enough to reproduce. And so we're going to see that the environment is shaping what traits are desirable and what traits are not. So that wraps up the 5 main points of natural selection. If you're having any issues with it, please give me, shoot me an email, or you can see me before or after class. There are some additional links posted, a really great video clip that I think helps explain it even more, in addition to the activities and the group work we're going to do in class.